Alle guten, alle bösen, folgen Welcome to this debate sponsored by ZeroHedge and underwritten by the JM Bullion Company. I'm Gene Epstein, director of the monthly Manhattan-based debate series, the Soho Forum. I've moderated nearly 100 debates. Given my experience as a moderator, as a moderate moderator, I should say, I have been invited to moderate this debate, and I'm honored to do so. Our two debaters are proof that George Washington University is not a monolithic institution because they are both professors at George Washington University. They are Professors Jonathan Turley and David Karpf. The resolution reads, Elon Musk's acquisition and management of Twitter has been a net positive for society. Now, both debaters have, of course, understand that when we're talking about Twitter as an institution that's managed, it's also called X. So we waive that problem. Both agreed that when they talk about Twitter, they're also talking about X. We've gotten that past us. But what we also want you to know is that speaking for the affirmative will be Professor Jonathan Turley. He will have 10 minutes to make the case that Elon Musk's acquisition and management of Twitter has been a net positive for society. Take it away, Professor Turley.
Well, thank you very much, Gene. Thank you also to Professor Karpf and also ZeroHedge and making this possible. I hope we have an interesting discussion tonight. I know that Professor Karpf has written extensively on Elon Musk, both his personal and professional issues. And I want to stress that I'm not nearly as informed as he is as to Musk as an individual. Indeed, my interest in Musk is, not surprisingly, focused on his contribution to free speech. And he has made, obviously, other contributions. I know that there's going to be some challenge of that, or there has with Professor Karpf. But when it comes to free speech, I think that there's an unchallengeable view that Elon Musk has been a tremendous source of positive change for free speech. You know, Elon Musk reminds me of Richard III when the Queen Mother Margaret is asked by the mother of the two princes in the tower how she could learn to hate. And she says it quite simply. She says, think of thy babies, that they were sweeter than they were, and that he who slew them was fouler than he is. In some ways, Musk's critics often treat Twitter as sweeter than it was, and he who bought Twitter is fouler than he is. In my book, The Indispensable Right, I discuss Musk and how important that purchase was. And it can be reduced to 2 words: Twitter files. This was a real sea change for the free speech community. I've testified regularly in Congress in both the House and Senate on free speech issues, and the change was considerable. Until he bought Twitter, there was an irresistible force in terms of the expansion of censorship. And with Musk, that irresistible force found the immovable object. They found the one guy that couldn't be coerced, who couldn't be really forced to engage in acts that are, in our view, fuel the anti-free speech movement. But most importantly, he released those files. And for someone who testified in many of these hearings, I have to tell you how transformative that was. Before Twitter was purchased, members would constantly challenge me and say, well, you don't have any proof the government is actually coordinating or involved in the censorship process. And this is all speculation. I would say, actually, it's not speculation. We do have information showing that there is coordination and there's considerable censorship that's occurring. But once the Twitter files were released, it changed. And suddenly members were admitting, yeah, of course we're censoring. Of course the government's involved. But they really have to be because we have to fight disinformation and misinformation and malinformation. And those are the 3 categories the Biden administration has said that they want to see social media companies like X, Facebook, remove. And malinformation is my favorite because that happens to be true facts that are used in the government's view in a misleading way. With the Twitter files, we saw the full range of this activity, which was even greater than some of us who had been writing about it for years. And just recently, we saw that the Biden administration has spent $267 million on misinformation, grants, and contracts. That is a minimum. We expect the figure to be much higher than that. That's in comparison to $6.7 million under Trump. Now, all of this, when we boil it down, comes to one simple fact: that the people most aggrieved by Musk taking over Twitter are those that did support the censorship, or what they call the content moderation efforts. It's not a coincidence that when he bought Twitter, Hillary Clinton and others went to Europe and asked Europe to use the Digital Services Act to censor Americans and others, to force the censorship, I should say, on Twitter. And they did precisely that. They have threatened Musk, and he has been the subject of a boycott that has combined this alliance. And I talk about that in my book as well, that we've never seen an alliance like this. We've gone through anti-free speech periods before, but we've never seen this alliance of corporate, media, academic, government interests aligned in this way. And Musk has had to deal with that. Today, there are an estimated 429 million users of X worldwide. I think I got that right. And it is true that Musk has had controversies with free speech. And I'm not certainly here to defend all of his decisions. He is not a perfect being. But what I can say as someone who is on perhaps the far end of the free speech community, none of us are true absolutists, but Musk is unparalleled in terms of his impact on free speech, in my view. And it comes down to, if you look historically of when this debate changed, it changed when he bought Twitter. It changed when he released the Twitter files. It forced Zuckerberg and Facebook to ultimately release the Facebook files, which showed an even broader censorship system. All of that changed. And if you want to look at when, X marks the spot. It's when he bought X. Now, I think that I know my time is running short, but I will say this. I understand we can have good faith disagreements about Musk's tenure at X. And as I've said, he has, in my view, made mistakes. I've criticized him when he has. But there's no question in my mind, he is the most consequential figure of free speech of his generation. We were heading to a very bad place when Twitter was taken over. And we now have a debate, and we had a recent election where free speech played a prominent role. So it comes back, I think, to what George Bernard Shaw said. He said that a reasonable man adjusts himself to the world, and an unreasonable man expects the world to adjust itself to him. And then he added, that's why all progress is made by unreasonable people. In my view, Elon Musk is that unreasonable person. Yeah, he is not perfect, and we can find many things to criticize. But he changed the trajectory of the anti-free speech movement. He gave the free speech community something we needed more than anything else. He gave us the Twitter files. He gave us proof. And that has shaped the debate since that moment. And X marks the spot when that happened.
All right. Your remarks are concluded, and you decided to take less than 10 minutes, which is fine with me. Professor Karpf, you have no right to borrow any minutes from Professor Turley. You've got to take your 10 minutes or any number of minutes less than that. You are speaking for the negative on the resolution. Elon Musk's acquisition and management of Twitter has been a net positive for society. Take it away, Professor Karpf.
Sure. So I was excited to get this invitation because I, for a long time, quite loved Twitter. I've been off it for over a year. I deleted my account a couple months ago. I can't say that I've missed it. Blue Sky is a lot better. Folks should check it out. But I was quite curious when getting the invitation how one would go about offering an argument that things are going well for Twitter, for Musk, or for any of us since the purchase. I'm still a bit curious, but we can get into that in Q&A, I guess. I have some questions. I personally think that the Twitter files turned out to be a total nothing burger. But I guess the place where I want to start is with a piece that was written by Nilay Patel of The Verge, editor-in-chief of The Verge. It was titled, "Welcome to Hell, Elon. You break it, you buy it." It was published October 28, 2022, the date of his purchase. It starts, the first line, "You fucked up real good, kiddo. Twitter is a disaster clown car company that is successful despite itself, and there's no possible way to grow users and revenue without making a series of enormous compromises that will ultimately destroy your reputation and possibly cause grievous damage to your other companies." What I would suggest to folks, A, is that it's worth looking that up. Go ahead and Google it and read the whole essay. Is I want to suggest to our audience that Nilay Patel was exactly right. Here we stand over 2 years later, and Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, turning it into X, hasn't gone well for him, hasn't gone well for the company, hasn't gone well for the user base, except for the folks who had been, I think, rightfully suspended from Twitter, who now came back on. I guess it's also gone well for the crypto shills and the spammers and the scammers who now buy $8 check marks, engage in bad faith debates to rack up views so they can get a check from him. But besides that, when he bought Twitter, Twitter was, to a certain extent, the public square. And it clearly is not anymore. And that isn't because people didn't like him and they fled. That's because he broke the thing. The reason why I left Twitter when I did was because what I noticed, I had about 42,000 Twitter followers. For folks who are familiar with who I am, I was briefly Twitter famous back in 2019. I got into an internet argument with a columnist named Brett Stevens, where I made fun of him, and then he contacted my university provost and tried to get me fired. I guess we could have a debate over which one of us was pro-free speech. I think the person who's trying to get you fired is probably the one who's trying to have a chilling effect on speech. But that's neither here nor there for the moment. But that left me with about 42,000 Twitter followers, which at the time I figured was about as large of an audience as an obscure academic like myself was ever going to find. And what I noticed after Elon Musk got rid of the legacy verification system and instead said, you will get a blue check if you pay me $8 a month, and everyone else, and you'll also get your content boosted in people's replies. You'll get it boosted in the algorithm. if you want people to see your stuff, you have to pay me money. Around that time, since I wasn't paying him, what I noticed was I have like 42,000 followers, and maybe 2,000 people are even encountering my content. It's like 5% of the people who followed me were still showing up. And what I was mostly doing on Twitter was bad faith debate with people who were there to pick fights because they don't like people like me. It stopped being fun, it stopped being interesting, and stopped being in any sense a real public square. And so I stopped showing up. In the years since then, he's also deprioritized anything with a link to content outside of Twitter. Blue Sky only has about 25 million users. That's much smaller in terms of sheer numbers. So it doesn't have nearly the bot problem. It doesn't have nearly the porn spam problem that we have on Twitter. Twitter also has a CSAM problem that you don't find on the other websites because he fired the staff who managed that problem. The management has been terrible. But what that has led to is outlets like The Guardian that are now no longer publishing on Twitter. Part of the reason they left is they realized people don't see our stuff there anymore. Part of what the company that he bought was, what it did well, was provided, Liam, I see you 5 minutes. Part of what it was doing well was being the backbone of the rest of the web, of the social web. It was the place where you could go to engage in public discussion and then see what people were writing elsewhere. And Elon, after he overpaid for the thing, then proceeded to degrade that so that you can no longer offer your stuff up on Twitter and find an audience anywhere else. So as it has turned inward, it's become a worse product. It's become a product where really the only way to get views is to offer up opinions that Elon himself will amplify, which goes very well for Professor Turley because Professor Turley says things that Elon Musk agrees with. But if we want spirited debate, we're no longer going to find it on Twitter. People have been emptying out of that website and fleeing elsewhere. Now, my scholarship, I'm not a law professor. I'm a political scientist who studies the internet and online political communities. And what I would have told you back in 2021 and 2022 was that it is effectively impossible to replace Twitter because of the network effects that it already has. Because once you have something installed like that, it's nearly impossible to get people to engage in other habits and move elsewhere. I was actually quoted in a Politico story about a week after he bought it, where I said I was probably going to be the last person, since I had struck gold with the Bret Stephens thing, I was like the last person who was going to leave Twitter. That's what I expected then, was it was simply impossible to replicate those network effects. And now what we've been seeing ever since is Twitter falling apart. It is still filled with bots. Elon said he was going to get rid of them. He didn't. It's now worth, according to Fidelity, about $9 billion. He paid $44 billion for it. We don't have a good handle anymore on just how much hate speech is happening there. That's because he shut down the access for any researchers trying to study it and sued anyone who went around him and tried to find any way to study it. That's generally not great behavior. If a company is suing anyone who wants to study content on its site, it's probably a sign that they don't want people to find out and make public what's going on there. If we value transparency, we should probably value that. Advertisers have fled, and his response to advertisers fleeing has been to sue them for not advertising anymore. Again, I'm not sure what Professor Turley's definition of free speech is, but if we're going to be requiring companies to keep advertising on a website in the name of free speech, that is at least not the version that I was taught when I studied constitutional law. Though granted, in undergrad, I didn't go for a law degree. Maybe I would have learned some other bizarre version of free speech that requires advertisers to keep on paying the richest man in the world. So what stands out to me is that his management of Twitter, I can't come up with any definition of society where his management of it has been a net positive. Hasn't gone well for Elon. It hasn't gone well for the users. Hasn't gone well for the advertisers. And as a society, what we have seen is people fleeing Twitter so that it is no longer the public square that it once was. This has gone poorly. And what I'm noticing in Professor Turley's opening remarks is that the only way he can defend Twitter is not talking about the state of it today. I'll end there.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Karpf. Now you're each going to have 7.5 minutes for rebuttal. You, of course, now have the opportunity to rebut Professor Karpf. Professor Turley, take it away.
Well, I think I would start by saying that, where Professor Karpf says that this was no longer the public square and that it had changed, it doesn't really seem consistent with me with the objections made by the professor and others about X. That is, the problem is it's too much of the public square. You're hearing from many people who disagree with you, some of them vehemently, and that is the public square. What you don't have is an echo chamber. You don't have a favorable, corporation that's working for you. Well, we did find, which is amazing, when the statement that the Twitter files was a nothing burger is really breathtaking. I go into my book about what's in those files. I mean, they were censoring jokes. They were censoring, people had dissenting views of COVID. People were barred and throttled and blacklisted. What's amazing is the CEOs of Twitter and Facebook ultimately apologized for that. And the standard that they used was chilling. That, when you had the former CEO, Dorsey, who apologized for engaging in censorship, he was replaced by Agarwal, who was unapologetic and said that his view to regulate content was reflective, quote, of the things we believe lead to a healthier public conversation, quote, focus less on thinking about free speech. That's his quote. That our role is particularly emphasized in who can be heard. And then one of the people that operated the censorship program said that they really viewed this as determining, whose free speech they want to protect and whose public safety is most important. And then in that ambiguous standard was a sweeping level of censorship. And the idea that you should all go to blue sky is rather funny. I mean, this week, for example, you had people complaining that they were libertarian or conservative on blue sky and that they were being threatened. And there were people on blue sky that saying that they should be barred on blue sky. Now, look, you can create a safe space. You can recreate what you had. There was no social media company that you could go to before Twitter bought X. They were one sort of monolithic whole, and they were all working with the US government in a censorship system that a federal court called perfectly Orwellian. Now there's one that is a departure and is driving people crazy. And so, yeah, you can go to blue sky. But, when I was at University of Chicago, I remember the later president of University of Chicago sent out an acceptance letter to people looking for safe spaces and said, congratulations on making it into University of Chicago. And in case you're worried about coming here, I just want you to know there are no safe spaces at the University of Chicago. We will not protect you from ideas. We will not protect you from the viewpoints of other people. So if you want safe spaces, this is not the place to come. Now, that's what a public square is. It has all of the problems. And yes, we are all trolled. We are all criticized. We all have these people who are horrific, in my view, in some of their views. That is the public square. And you can subscribe and watch the people you want to. What you can't do is what you did before, which is engage in rampant censorship to target those, to cancel those who have opposing views.
All right. Professor Karpf, 7.5 minutes of rebuttal from you.
Sure. So I'll admit I have not read Professor Turley's new book. And again, I think it might be worth me writing a review because our disagreement over the nature of the Twitter files could fill several hours or several volumes. So let's set that aside. It seems like our fundamental disagreement is that I believe I've heard you say that content moderation and censorship are the same thing. I would suggest that they are different, that Twitter as a private company, and in fact, all social media platforms, and again, this goes back to Nilay Patel's essay on the day that Elon bought Twitter. One of the things that he noted was that content moderation is the service that you offer users. Now, one thing you're factually incorrect about is that prior to his purchase of Twitter, there were plenty of social networks that could offer conservatives who were getting banned on Twitter the freest of free speech. They could go to Gab if they wanted to. Some of them did, and what they realized is, hey, there's nobody here for us to argue with. There were company after, and I see you laughing, sir, but there was company after company that looked at the market for Twitter and said, this company is too anti-free speech we are going to offer different content moderation in order to provide a better product. And nobody showed up. The only way to provide that was for the world's richest man to come in and buy it and try to turn Twitter into Gab. They could also go to Truth Social. Again, they didn't. What they needed to do instead was buy the largest company to turn it into a platform that had the content moderation that they preferred. So I would suggest to you that content moderation is a service that is offered by social media platforms, and censorship is a thing that is done by the government. And I understand that there's a set of people, yourself, Jim Jordan, I guess Matt Taibbi, who all believe that there was some grand conspiracy between the research community that studied COVID misinformation and then said to the Surgeon General, hey, here's what people are saying, and some Orwellian something or other. I would suggest to you that a fairer reading of those documents would lead us to believe that researchers letting the Surgeon General know about what people are saying online about COVID is not Orwellian censorship, even if you found one judge one time who would say that. But I do think our fundamental disagreement here is whether or not content moderation is the same thing as government censorship. And I think you're cheapening the term government censorship to equate the two.
Do we get a response or?
Yes, well, okay. Yes, indeed. We now get to the free for all.
Let's argue.
I'm sorry. We now get to the free for all, but we also have a word from the sponsor of this debate. So take it away, Mr. Sponsor.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver.
We're
to
now
grow
off
your
the
wealth,
air.
Whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
All right, we now get to the free for all part of the evening. The way I'd like it to run is that I will ask either of you, first the affirmative, to go first. If you would like to ask a question of David Karpf, you can indeed ask him, when did you stop beating your wife? He'll know how to respond. So the question can be provocative, but start with a question, and then let's see what Professor Karpf has to say, and then let's see if you have any response. So, Professor Turley, what question do you want to put to Professor Karpf at this point?
Well, I would start out by asking what it is that he would say to many of these scientists who were canceled, who were throttled, who ultimately were vindicated. Some of these people were, in fact, barred on social media, including X, for raising questions about the efficacy of masks or the lab theory, things that federal agencies now embrace. There's still a debate going on, but that debate didn't occur then. That seems to me more than just sort of modest content moderation. And I'll note that when you say that I equate, content moderation and being all censorship, that's because that's the term that these companies use ubiquitously in content moderation. The ACLU and other organizations disagree with you, Professor. They do not view all censorship as limited to the government controlling speech. They believe that censorship can involve private companies precisely like this. And so they just simply disagree with your view.
No, okay, so the ACLU does not, if you understood my view correctly. My understanding of Section 230, and again, that's a law, so we could talk more to your colleagues at GW Law than my colleagues at the School of Media and Public Affairs. but my understanding of the history of Section 230 is that the idea there was to encourage social media platforms as companies to be able to engage in content moderation without being held liable for user speech. They wanted to encourage that back in the 1990s, that fundamental protection, the 26 words that invented the internet, to quote Professor Jeff Kosek, that has been fundamental to the creation of these regimes. The idea that in a world with Section 230, there's no gap between content moderation and government censorship is just absurd. But to answer your question, though, what I would say to the people who feel that they were being canceled is, how is your career doing now? Because most of these people who you're holding up as having been so deeply wronged, so deeply harmed, seem to be doing great right now. And a number of them, I believe, are going to be taking jobs in the Trump administration. So again, that to me suggests that there's a difference between a private company deciding that your style of speech is unwelcome here and the government censoring your views.
Can I respond? Or
Yes. Yeah.
Argue back and forth. Let's do it.
First of all, I feel like we jumped rails there. I was responding to your saying that I was wrong to treat content moderation as censorship because censorship is something that's done by the government. That's what what I believe the ACLU and others would disagree with you, Professor, on, is that statement. As for Section 230, and we can have certainly a debate about what should happen there. But what I'm particularly confused about is this idea that somehow in a debate of whether censorship occurred or whether it was right, that we have to balance as to whether these people still have their jobs. Many of them don't, by the way. Many of them have not been brought back on associations where they were barred, where they were shunned and they were marginalized. Some have, as you noted, been able to secure their positions. But what does that matter in the debate we're having? Whether they were able to ultimately survive shouldn't be the measure of whether censorship occurred or whether it was wrong.
Okay, so we don't have a tight definition here of what we mean by canceling. And the problem there is that for most of the time when we're talking about canceling, what we're actually talking about is counterspeech. There are people with abhorrent views who then feel that they are canceled, who then don't end up in the same associations that they used to be. That's because people's counterspeech is also free speech. And then there's some people who feel that they were wrongly targeted or they were made the center of people's views. And I think like a good example here, I think, is the comedians who have been canceled. Louis C.K. was canceled. Then he sold out, was it Madison Square Garden, and won an award for the show. As cancellations go, I would say that harm that he faced by facing public reprisal on social media sites is far and away different than the government censoring your speech, shutting down speech. And you're right that the ACLU would say that it's possible for there to be censorship from non-governmental entities. I'm pretty sure that the lawyers that I know at the ACLU would say that a company engaging in content moderation is not necessarily engaging in censorship, and equating to the two is sloppy.
May I step in and exercise moderator's prerogative? Since I did have Professor J. Bhattacharya, epidemiologist from Stanford, debate this very issue at the SO Forum. And in fact, he did another debate. Now, he and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, and I forgot the woman's name, but she was from Oxford, they were all branded fringe epidemiologists despite their credentials. And he was shown, Bhattacharya was shown orders from on high, from the government, to make sure that whatever he put on Twitter was kept limited, and where access to it was almost impossible for people like me to get. So it's not so much that I care about Jay Bhattacharya's career. It's only that the government was essentially telling Twitter, if I want to find out what Jay Bhattacharya has to say on Twitter, I'm screwed, because the government and the NIH doesn't like it. And of course, ironically, Professor Karpf, as you know, Jay Bhattacharya is now being made head of NIH by that lunatic Trump, which of course I regard as a triumph. The very institution that tried to destroy his reputation. He even had death threats, but that's not the point. I was denied access to his information as a Twitter user because the government didn't like what he was saying. So therefore, the government was doing that, and I would regard that as censorship that happily Musk turned around by allowing Bhattacharya complete access to Twitter. So that was a step forward.
So if I can respond to our moderator,
Yes.
what I would say there is,
Yeah.
I understand that you quite like his views and are upset that you weren't able to see them on Twitter. His views at that time were very easy to access, partially because he was able to say, look at how I'm being canceled, and still heard in many different forums.
Okay.
I'd suggest to you that that force of cancellation isn't the death knell that it has been made out to seem like.
Yeah.
I understand like death threats are bad, and I don't think it's good if he faced them.
Yeah.
But I would suggest to you that over the course of his career, if he was able to brand himself as this like bold challenger to the status quo, fight against that status quo and triumph, then I would suggest that cancellation is maybe not such a death knell that it's being made out to be.
If I could respond for a second, once again, I'm really troubled by this line of argument, in that we're talking about censorship in terms of free speech, which in my view is an inherent wrong. In my view, free speech is a human right, but we can disagree as to whether censorship is confined to the government or not. But the point is that to argue that, look, they survived, it's sort of like a doctor saying, yes, I committed malpractice, but I didn't kill the patient. The point is that, yes, some of them will survive. Yes, you can probably find forums in which they could be heard. That's not the debate we're having. The question is whether it's right for these social media companies to do what they did, to engage in censorship. And what the accounts of people like this really bring to mind is that often those people in the anti-free speech community that favor, censoring disinformation and misinformation, is they talk about the costs of that, but they rarely talk about the cost of censorship itself. The cost during the pandemic is that we really didn't have this debate on social media, that we could have had the debate of the 6-foot rule, that now the CDC is saying they never had science supporting the 6-foot rule. We could have had a more robust debate over why European countries were not shutting down schools that are very young. We have really encountered now lasting emotional and educational problems from those decisions. Those are the costs of censorship. Now, the fact that people can survive is a rather chilling test in determining whether this was a good or bad thing. When people say cancel, they're not talking about being disappeared or ended. It's a wrong in itself. And that's what I find so troubling about your argument.
Mr. Turley, are you familiar with amplification on social media?
Yes.
Algorithmic amplification.
Yes.
So what they are complaining about when they say I'm being canceled is I am not reaching the audience that I believe I have a right to, or that I would be getting if they were making different policy decisions. Now, since we have these social media companies that award more views to some content than others, there is no level playing field. It is on the companies to decide what sorts of content do we most want to promote, and therefore what content are we promoting less of. And that is up to the companies. That's the reason why content moderation is a service provided by the companies, is that they need to decide what are we most going to amplify. Your complaint, this idea that, oh, they're being denied an audience and that is a denial of free speech. This idea, frankly, that people who are concerned and study disinformation and misinformation, and I am part of that research community, sir, the idea that that makes us anti-free speech, I get that that probably helps you to sell books, but it's intellectually dishonest, right? We're not anti-defamation.
May I, forgive me, I'm sorry.
No, I need to finish.
I just want to remind that the resolution simply says that Musk was a net positive, not that Musk threw out Joe Stalin, not that he threw out Putin. He was just did a net positive. I
Sure.
thought it was a net
Question
positive.
then is
it was a net
Twitter
positive.
better or worse right now?
That Jay
I would
Bhattacharya.
suggest to you, if you think Twitter is better now, that means that you have some very particular views, because for nearly everyone who uses Twitter, it's worse now than before he picked it.
I want to. May I ask you a question? You
Please.
mentioned, I'm glad that you are willing to be candid about somebody who also tried to get me fired,
Mhm.
Brett Stevens.
Yeah, that in common. All right.
Brett Stevens was at the Wall Street Journal. I was at Barron's. He didn't like the fact that I produced a book review that criticized one of his books, and he tried to get me fired. What I'm not clear about, just to clarify your position, is that if Brett Stevens tried to get you fired, it sounds like you really do belong on Twitter. Could you elaborate on that story? It might bear on your relationship to Twitter and what Musk did.
So the story there, this is for people who remember the moment in 2019. This is the bedbug story. There was this was actually the first day of school at GW. I had just taught a class. I look at my phone after class. There was a headline going around that bedbugs have been found in the New York Times newsroom. And everyone was doing the standard Twitter thing of making their jokes riffing on that headline. Like both sides, like here's what the bedbugs have to say, whatever joke they could come up with. And the segment of Twitter that I participate in back then, I spent a lot of time with the environmental movement. I'm a climate guy, and my crowd doesn't particularly like Brett Stevens. And so the joke that I made, not using his Twitter handle because that would have been rude, was I said, the bedbugs are a metaphor. The bedbugs are Brett Stevens. My thinking being that bedbugs are a little obnoxious and hard to get rid of, and that strikes me as Brett Stevens' tenure at the New York Times. That joke got 0 retweets. It got 9 likes. It was not a hit. And then, even though I didn't use his Twitter handle, he searched his name and emailed me and the provost of my university saying I had set a new low for discourse on the internet. Followed that up the next day on MSNBC, saying that I was my using that term was akin to he didn't use the term Nazi, but like an authoritarian regime, which struck me as an oversight or an overstatement. The entire internet made fun of him, and he got rid of his Twitter Twitter profile. That Friday, he released he wrote a column for the New York Times saying that the Nazi propagandists had radio, and today we have Twitter, and the people who are most at risk are centrist columnists who are being attacked by liberal academics. So though he didn't use my name, he effectively called me a Nazi propagandist in the pages of the New York Times. I am Jewish, by the way. I checked around at the JCC, and nobody at the JCC thought that calling someone a bedbug was a anti-Semitic slur. But he and I had that disagreement. The entire internet agreed with me on that and roasted him in counter speech, so he went away. So again, I am in favor of robust counter speech. I'm even fine with people calling each other names. I just think we should also keep power in mind. The reason he emailed me and my university provost, if he had just emailed me, I would have had a conversation with him about the joke. But he included the provost in order to force me to behave by engaging a power structure so that I would have to look up and say, my job is on the line, I better genuflect to this guy.
Well,
I think we should have power in mind here, which again is the reason why people demanding that they have a right to amplification should think about why they think that they have that right to not just Twitter speech, but Twitter reach. The people complaining about shadow banning, Twitter is always deciding what it's going to algorithmically amplify. Now it's whatever Elon likes. I don't think that's actually better than what we had before, though I guess if I had the stances of Jonathan Turley, maybe I would, because Elon does like what Jonathan Turley has to say, not so much what I have to say.
Well, Brett Stevens, of course, in the email, he copied everybody at News Corp who had any power at all about what I had done in a similar fashion. Well,
if I could respond to a couple things. First of all,
yes.
There's no need to make personal attacks. We can have this discussion. We honestly could.
Not a personal attack. I'm saying that you're
without suggesting I'm trying to sell books or Elon Musk is. It's just not that conducive to having a good discussion. I think we can have a good discussion. And what I'd like to say,
I'm also trying to sell books. We all are.
Okay, if I could finish,
right. Please.
So when you talk about counter speech, that's what we are in fact discussing. That the whole issue here of, yes, private companies have a right to control their own speech. I've never denied that. I've said it repeatedly. I'm not saying that these companies are required to stop censorship. What we're talking about is whether it is right and whether this company is like any other company. One of the things I've said in my testimony is that social media companies are communication companies. They have actually overtaken telephones as the preferred form of communication for citizens. And, many people are on social media much more than they are on telephones. And so the question is, should those companies bear some responsibility, precisely as you say, to allow for counter speech? When you talk about how really canceling is not quite as bad as I suggest it is because these people kept their jobs or did well recently, it moves us away from the central question of whether it is indeed right, whether these companies should be a broader platform. And, part of the complaint is that too many voices that were once banned on Twitter are now being heard on Twitter. Now, you can listen and read to whatever extent you want, right? You control what you read. You control who you follow. So you have that throttle control. The question is the role of the company itself. Now, as to the COVID controversies, that had a demonstrable impact, and not just on social media, but in the academy, that in higher education, these people were isolated, they were shunned, they were labeled as people who were often on news articles would say would be banned or restricted on social media. They've been vindicated to some extent. You have the New York Times saying that anyone who's suggesting that the virus came from a lab is engaging in racism and that it should not even be covered. That viewpoint shouldn't be covered by the media. That was the viewpoint that we saw often that was removed. Now you have federal agencies saying, yeah, we think that's the most logical explanation. My point here is not to take sides in any of these views. And I'll note, Professor, that most of the Democratic members of Congress I know are on Twitter. There's plenty of liberals on Twitter. So Musk is not just allowing people on Twitter he agrees with. Many of his critics actually criticize him on Twitter. So I understand the controversies with Elon Musk, but we don't have to overplay it, right? We can actually have a substantive conversation that doesn't exaggerate what's happening on Musk. There are plenty of Democrats and liberals and critics of Musk that appear on X.
Sir, I don't think you're taking amplification seriously here. Again, it is up to the company, which is engaging in providing algorithmic social media, to decide what are we going to amplify. I would encourage you, if we want to have an intelligent discussion about Elon Musk's tenure at Twitter, it's worthwhile reading Walter Isaacson's biography. It's worthwhile reading any of the three major books that have been written by journalists about his tenure there and how it's gone. None of those, including Isaacson, who is quite kind to Musk overall, none of those would describe that as having been a net positive for society or having gone well for Elon or really anyone. But what we're talking about here is these large companies that need to decide what sorts of content do we want to put in front of people? What things do we want to amplify? Freedom of reach is what's at play here, and that's an Elonism too. So in the midst of that, do they want to amplify? As we saw in this past election, Elon endorsed Donald Trump and then mostly amplified people who were agreeing that Donald Trump is the best and is going to win. And Democrats had a hard time getting heard on there. Again, that's fine. They don't have a right to get heard here. But it's unsurprising that post-election, Democrats and many other people are deciding, this is not the place for me. This is mostly just the place where I get called racial slurs. So they're deciding to leave for other people. That too is free speech, obviously. But what I would suggest to you here is that you're really not taking either power or amplification seriously. Elon Musk has decided that the things that he wants to amplify are the types of content that he wants to hear. Having bought the platform, he has the right to do that. But I don't think as a society we're better off for it. And certainly neither Elon nor the company are better off. If the question we're here to debate is, has this been a net positive for society? I can't find any definition besides the one you're trying to carve out for your version of free speech, where the answer could possibly be in the affirmative. Things have gone very poorly.
Um,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah. Well, a question for you, Professor. Just to wrap one part of it up, Professor Karpf, I take it you have no regrets about that little joke you made at Brett Stevens' expense. You have no regret about what you did, correct?
No, it was. I thought it was. I probably have. I've made better jokes, but it was a joke.
Yeah.
Yeah, not at all.
That's good to know. Okay. I don't think you should have any regrets either. Professor Turley, um, uh, when we talk about net positives, and when you mentioned as well that you too are critical of, of Elon Musk and some of the things he's done, I noticed, for example, Professor Karpf reporting something I was unaware of, that he's bringing some kind of legal action against those who refuse to advertise on his site. I don't know, things of that sort. Could you give us the 4 or 5 things that you don't like from your perspective that Elon Musk has done?
Well, first of all, in terms of the advertiser lawsuit, I criticized that lawsuit. I didn't feel it was well based, and I didn't think it was a very serious threat to those companies. At the same time, I have written a lot about the campaign to target advertisers. The anti-free speech movement has done this for years. It's not just with Twitter. They have targeted conservative groups. You had some of the grant recipients of the Biden administration were organizations that were ranking sites in terms of their danger of disinformation to send to advertisers to essentially cut off funding for those sites. In one of those grants, virtually all of the top 10 most dangerous sites were conservative or libertarian sites. It included, Reason, which is just a bunch of libertarian nerds, many of whom I know, who are just holding forth on legal subjects from their own perspective. And ultimately, when some of us wrote about that, the Biden administration sort of did a reversal and said that they weren't going to fund that anymore in this global disinformation system. But this effort to target advertisers is a big part of the anti-free speech movement. And Musk was the greatest example of that. The minute he bought Twitter, everyone went ballistic, it seemed. You had people like Clinton and others going to try to get the Digital Services Act to be used against Twitter to threaten Musk financially, even with an arrest. Some of them actually threatened that he could be arrested. When he gave an interview with Trump, you had one of the top figures at the EU saying that we're going to watch that interview and you will be hit with a prosecution if we feel that you are spreading disinformation through that interview. Now, that was an interview with the leading candidate for president. Now, this gets back to where we are and how we got here. There has been a change, and for some of us who I've also been targeted, I probably have the longest standing cancel campaign in academia. People try to get me fired every day with my dean and the president. They've done that since back in the Clinton administration. So this happens. This is a reality of who we are. But one of the things that is so problematic is the effort to not only focus on advertisers, but to get the DSA, get the EU to try to force Twitter to engage in more censorship, to get them to remove more voices. Now, look, you can run to Blue Sky. You can go to Blue Sky, and that is a very heavily liberal site, although some conservatives have gone over and said that they are being attacked there. But look, you can create that safe space for yourself, and good luck with that. The question that some of us are putting out there is what should be the mission of social media companies? And recently, Facebook also apologized for the very things that the professor is talking about. That is, they said that they shouldn't have been engaging in some of this conduct. And that was a good thing. Zuckerberg finally came out and released the Facebook files. Those would never have been released, in my view, if the Twitter files had not been released. But they were released. And it has given us even more insights into this censorship complex that does involve government and academic and different interests.
So you're saying that,
Can
if
I
I heard you correctly, you're saying that the advertising case, that you agree with Professor Karpf, was a bad thing.
Yep.
Is there anything else that anything major that you would say that Musk has done that you don't like?
Yeah, for example, he has limited the use of Twitter essentially to favor competitors of Twitter, things like Substack. He is also, there have been accounts, I haven't pursued it, of his targeting critics. None of that is good. And when those reports came out, I was critical of them. Those are not hard calls to make. But what I can tell you is that having gone through the Twitter period and I'm in the X period, I wouldn't trade it for anything, in the sense that there is much more broad discussion happening on X. And that means there's a lot of bad discussion too. And this may be proof that I'm sort of a free speech dinosaur. It's true that I believe that the solution of bad speech is good speech. I do believe that good speech prevails. It doesn't mean that you get rid of bad speech. When I have debates, they often say, well, look at all the racism around us. Good speech doesn't mean that it's going to create good people out of everyone. You're going to have racists. You're going to have trolls. But one of the things I ask in the book is point to a single censorship system that's ever worked in history, that it hasn't killed one idea. It hasn't killed one movement, because this is a human right. Free speech is a human right. And you can't deny it without denying who we are. That's why censorship is always done so poorly. But what I'm trying to encourage in our discussion tonight is for us to look at first principles here of what companies should do, not what they can do. And I think that's a much more important question to ask.
So if I can reply.
Yes.
First, of course, you prefer X to the Twitter era. Your content is the type of content that now gets amplified. Amplification is always, again, that's a content moderation choice. They now make content moderation choices that go very well for you. You can pretend that's just the marketplace of ideas. The problem here, and going back a little further, because again, you don't want to say that you want to sell books, but you're an author, you got to try to sell books. I'm sure it feels great to get that many views on your content, have the world's richest man often agreeing with you. But what I want to suggest to you is this idea that we just need sort of an old school marketplace of ideas without taking amplification seriously or monetization seriously. Easily the worst thing that Elon Musk has done to Twitter in his tenure is this revenue sharing agreement, where he encourages people, if you can produce content that can get lots of eyeballs, he'll send you a check. Because that encourages styles of speech that are just nonsense argumentation. It is the opposite of the sort of rational critical discourse that we idealize as what we want from a marketplace of ideas. Because of course, when there's money on the line, people are going to figure out, how can I game that system to make more money? That's what we do in markets when the's money.
He doesn't quite get me where I want.
Can I respond to that? I'd like to respond to that. First of all, in terms of the incentive to get more views, I don't think that can be confined to whatever people get from X, which is not a huge amount in most cases. But where I object, Professor, and I wish you would think about this, is that when you engage in a debate with someone about free speech and constantly come back to, well, sure, you support X because it's good for you. I supported free speech before Elon Musk ever came on the scene. I have long written about free speech. I'm not supporting X because it works to my advantage, but the effort to portray some of us as, oh, you're just doing this because you're getting something from it, is really sort of the lowest form of debate, right? I mean, we
Do
can
you think if you were
actually
seeing fewer views now than you were before, that your opinion would be the same?
Yes. First, my opinions haven't changed on free speech. You can go
Oh,
back.
your opinion of how X is doing, because we're here to debate whether or not it's
Well,
done well or
in
poorly.
terms of X, I was a critic of Twitter when it was engaging in censorship. I was not personally censored. I was not targeted. I was not suppressed. I was doing fine on Twitter. I have almost 1 million followers on Twitter, and I had a large following back then too. So I didn't have a personal complaint about Twitter. I was upset about the policies of Twitter. So it's possible, Professor, for some of us to have these objections, and not because we're getting something out of it from Elon Musk that he's,
So, again,
that he's
I think you're
spending
reading that
all
more
our way.
seriously than intended, because I study political economy. Again, I think people follow their incentives. You mentioned you have 1 million followers now. Can you estimate how many you had in 2022 before you took over?
I don't remember, but look, it's grown every single year I've been on Twitter. I've been on Twitter for a very long time. I haven't, the fact is, in terms of what the growth rate, I don't know. But my point only is that these are my views, not because it's working for me, that I'm getting something out of it. You can at least give me enough respect to believe that my views on free speech are really separate from my own personal advantage, that I'm an academic and a law professor who's written and litigated on free speech for 30 years.
So I think we're engaging in different debates here, because you're asking me to engage in a debate about ideals of free speech. I was invited to come here to have a debate over, has his management of Twitter been net positive or negative for society? I don't think it is undercutting you or disrespecting you to say that where we stand is partially going to be related to where we sit on the opinion not of free speech, but how has Twitter gone? If you've had a fourfold increase, let's say, in your follower count during Elon's tenure, I would imagine that would lead you to think this is going great. Whereas people who have mostly found their replies degraded and their ability to get people to view their content going downhill would look at it and say, this has gone terribly. That's not to deride your opinions of free speech. It's to say that your experience of Twitter probably informs how you think it's gone.
No, my point is only that when Twitter was Twitter, I was writing continually and testifying in Congress about those who were being censored. That was not to enhance my own views. It was because I believed it. Now, we can have a discussion of what's a net positive for society. And you said, I have no idea what that definition is. For my definition, it has a lot to do with free speech. I think there is freer speech on X right now than there was. And I think that most of the people complaining about X would agree with that, because they're trying to get less speech. They're trying to get the DSA involved. They're trying to get ways to force Musk to censor more people. But it is freer. And some of us who are advocates of free speech, that is our default. And that's why we were critical during the Twitter period with the censorship system.
I do think the idea that other countries enforcing their own regulatory regimes is in some way a conspiracy or a backhanded attack from folks over here is an absurdity that I don't think we'll get into tonight. But I do want to note that from my perspective, that's a little rich, but you and I can always grab coffee on campus to debate that one.
I don't think I said that. What I said,
you said that people in the US are going around to try to get DSA.
That the anti-free speech, yes, that figures like Hillary Clinton, who I do view as demonstrably anti-free speech, one of the first things she did was try to enlist the DSA and the EU. That's a fact. And that is, she's been one of the central figures that has been most criticized by some of us in this anti-free speech movement that we see building around the world.
I think if we spoke to people in Europe, they would tell you that they don't take orders from Hillary Clinton, and she's had very little role there.
I didn't say that. I don't know why you wanted to take it there. I'm just saying I'm saying that the effort is try to get external measures to censor Twitter through the EU. I'll also note, by the way, that free speech isn't a free fall in Europe. There was a recent poll that showed that only 17% of Germans felt comfortable speaking their views in public. they're silencing the wrong people. They've always had a robust censorship system. So there's a reason why many of the figures from the United States called out to the EU, which in my view is a distinctly anti-free speech organization. But the point here, in connected to the subject of our discussion, is that he's getting hammered by many of these same forces. And I think that it's commendable that he has stood his ground.
Can I
Okay.
ask you, Professor Karpf, the flip question?
Yeah.
With respect to the net positive, I'd, of course, ask Professor Turley what's negative. And so I would like to ask you, since we're speaking about nets, is there anything at all that Musk has done that you give a thumbs up to?
No.
Okay.
The one management decision he had that I and others were critical of at the time that turned out better than I expected. This is not to say there's been a net positive, but at least went against my predictions. He fired about 80% of the people working at Twitter. I expected that was going to be cutting way too close to the bone and could just crater the system. Twitter as a company prior to his acquisition had a very large headcount so that they could try to stand up new products quickly to compete. And so there was a lot of headcount that they were able to reduce without grinding the thing to dust. So I thought that headcount was going to be disastrously cut. I don't think it has gone well at all, but there was, in retrospect, there was some fat to trim. So I will give him credit for that he did see that bit. But besides that, I would say if we went back to 2022 and invited ourselves back then to make predictions of how is this going, I think it's gone about as poorly for Twitter as I thought it would. And again, the evidence there, Twitter at this point is becoming an echo chamber of the people who are still sticking around because they like the views that they get. But people are fleeing in droves from the site, and what's left are people who are propping up cryptocurrencies and sort of their weird podcasts.
If I could respond to that, Professor, that's what I mean, is that seems a pretty exaggerated viewpoint. Take a look. You've got hundreds of millions of people who use Twitter. You have, I don't know what percentage of Democratic members.
Do you know what percentage are bots?
Democratic, but there's plenty of liberals and Democrats that still use Twitter. You're right. Some people have left for other locations. I get that. But if you let me finish, please. But to say that the Twitter is just there is propping up, marketers and all of that stuff, I think it really undermines your argument. Like I think you have some points to make about amplification. I understand that in terms of the sort of monetary response that you get. I understand that too. I disagree with the weight you're giving it. But to exaggerate and say that Twitter is now all these people that just simply agree with Elon Musk is simply just not true.
Sir, are the trend lines good or bad?
I understand how we got to trend lines. There are people who are, I said, there are people who are leaving X. What I'm saying is that to exaggerate and say that the people left on X are people that just simply prop up Musk and support his views, that's demonstrably not true, right?
I apologize if you don't like people speaking in exaggerations at 8 p.m. during a day that they spent grading. You're right. I sometimes talk in a bit of exaggeration. The point I was making is that from October 2022, when he acquired it to today, the trend lines for Twitter and for its role in public debate are clearly negative. Do you disagree with that?
No, he's everything I read is he is losing revenue and he has people who are leaving X. The question is whether X itself is a positive thing for society, not whether it's profitable for Musk. Musk could have made a lot more money doing a lot other things than.
Sure, he's very rich. Yes.
Okay. No. My point is only that he obviously, could have done better with his money, and maybe X is not making money. It sounds like it's not. But the question of whether it's positive is not whether it's profitable, but whether it's good to have a social media company that broke away in this respect. And
okay, sorry, I'll make my point, but I don't want to interrupt. Finish your point, please.
No. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so that again goes back to the point that I've been trying, I guess, unsuccessfully to make. Going back to what Nilay Patel said originally, which is that content moderation is the service provided. I don't care that Elon Musk himself is losing money on Twitter. Again, he has what, $450 billion? He can afford it. What I would suggest to you is that the reason why the trend lines are bad for Twitter in terms of people and organizations using it, you're right that there are still Democrats on the site, but there are more people leaving than there are coming now. And the accounts that are signing up seem to have an awful lot of bots on them, even though he was insisting he was going to solve that problem. So what I'm suggesting to you is that if we assume in 2022 that there was some value that Twitter had for society, I would suggest to you that the trend line for the value it has for society is going down, because the version of free speech that he has trotted out, the things he decides to amplify, are driving people away.
No, what I would say in response to that is that regardless of what the trend lines are, I can't really speak to that. I don't. That's not my bailiwick. But in terms of the positive aspect to social media, I think that having X be X has changed the dimension of dialogue. That many people who are leaving X don't like to hear these opposing views. They don't like to hear the cacophony of different voices and viewpoints. And they're going to a site that promises them more homogeneity, more of an echo chamber. And that's cool. That's fine. If that's what you want, that's what a lot of people do. We live in an echo chambered media environment. But in terms of having X be X, I think does contribute greatly to free speech, that you do have a forum that people who felt excluded before feel that they have more of an ability to speak now. It is not the largest social media company. Facebook is the Battlestar Galactica in comparison to Twitter. But it is sort of interesting that the smaller of the choices has driven many on the left crazy by its mere existence. You can be on Twitter and not engage with people, right? You can follow who you want to follow. You can do so many things on Twitter to control who you're corresponding with.
That's always true.
But when you were saying, this is all about counter speech, right? And you don't like counter speech. I love counter speech. I'm a free speech advocate. It's all counter speech. And yeah, there's a lot more of that perhaps some on the left have to deal with on X. I think it's a healthier environment than to go to an echo chamber.
I would suggest that you've got an ideal of rational critical debate there that doesn't hold up. There was plenty of counter speech on Twitter during the actual Twitter era. There were conservatives and there were liberals on there. The dimension, like the people who got moved off of Twitter back then, a lot of them were actual white nationalists, and then they were brought back. He was insisting he was not going to have Alex Jones on the platform. Then he decided no, I'm going to have Alex Jones on the platform, and now he's amplifying the guy. So people are voting with their feet, not saying, oh, I need a safe space away from conservatives, because again, there were plenty of them back there and we all showed up and were addicted to the site. What is driving people away is a type of speech where they're getting, again, you mentioned earlier, like they're getting death threats. It has always been tough to be a woman on Twitter. It got a lot worse in the X era. And with a company deciding, no, that's free speech, we like all of this, users then voted with their feet and stood up other networks. That suggests that the content moderation preferences
for the sake of the audience, I have not looked this up. Can either of you give me an estimate of users or hits or tweets or bot excluded, any kind of estimate? Where was Twitter at its peak and where is it now? Is it down from, can either of you give me a ballpark estimate of where it is now compared to where it was at its peak, so we can get a sense of how much it's bled?
So it's probably 10 to 20%. It's very difficult to say, again, because the outside organization, like it is a difficult number to track. Like it is technically very difficult to track because they have to exclude bots. They need to exclude accounts that get set up and never get used. This is, if people know what MDAU is, that falls into that. There was part of a Elon lawsuit back when he's trying to get out of it that was all around how they measure these things. So it is technically difficult. And most of the public measures all got shut down because the API is no longer accessible. So we have to rely on, there's a company called SimilarWeb that is probably the best one out there for tracking that data. I think it's like after the election, I think it dropped about 7% overall since acquisition. It's probably in the 10, 20, 30 range, but
Okay.
it's a hard number to actually track. It's
Let's say it's 30% down.
Yeah.
What does that mean in terms of absolute numbers of users or tweets? What is 30%
Well,
down?
in terms of the current numbers, the last one I saw was that there were 429 million X users worldwide, of which 106 million of those users were in the United States, which is a very high percentage of the U.S. population. Now, obviously, Facebook is larger still, but it is still a massive platform that.
Would you agree, Professor? Would you agree that? So, in other words, 30% down. Professor Turley says that means 100 million users.
No, I don't know if it's 30% down. I just gave you the only figure.
No. I only meant in terms of Professor Karpf's framework that if he thinks it's possibly 30% down, does that translate to approximately 100 million users?
In the United States, no.
No. You think
again, the question is whether we're talking about total accounts, which is going to include a lot of bot accounts that they're constantly weeding out. I mean, when you look at surveys, like if you look at a Pew survey,
yeah.
At its peak, Twitter was only getting usage from, I think it was like 7 to 10% of the U.S. population. So it's never actually been that high unless we're counting a different number. Let's say, for the sake of argument, so we don't all have to look up tabs, let's say prior to Musk's takeover that maybe 10% of the U.S. population was using Twitter. It might be down to 7 now. Just ballpark. That's probably not way off.
Of the adult population, so that could be the adult population being so that could be that's still in the tens of millions.
Yeah.
Certainly. Okay, all right. And I have a question for you, Mr. Karpf, because I am a little puzzled as a Twitter user. I could read you a whole list of economists who get a fair amount of following, who are very big supporters of Biden's record in the economy. I could read you a whole list of politicians and other analysts, from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Robert Reich, socialists like Ben Burgess. I have a huge list of those I follow who are left wing or supporters of Biden, supporters of Bidenomics, and they have many followers. So am I deluded into thinking that I'm getting a fair representation of opinion by informed academicians in economics or in politics about views that in many cases call Elon Musk a total SOB and that love Biden, that hate Trump? In fact, I've written a lot of criticism as a Twitter user of Elon Musk. Do you think that I'm deluding myself to think that Twitter is giving me a representation of those views, left-wing, democratic, and so on?
You a little bit are, and I can tell you why. You're looking at the wrong data points.
Yeah.
What you want to track is not those. Like if you follow those accounts and you only use the timeline of who you follow, then you can still get a decent representation because essentially you are opting out of the algorithm and instead just reading the people you chose to read. But what you will find if you look at, if you were to track the number of views that their content gets over time, particularly content that includes, say, a link to an op-ed that they wrote somewhere, what you're going to see is a stark downward trend because under Elon, they decided to start suppressing outside links from Twitter. That's not just to Substack, but to anywhere, to CNBC, to ZeroHedge, to anywhere. Content on other websites now gets suppressed by Twitter. That was an algorithmic choice in order to keep people on the sites they could serve ads to them, which again, as a company, I can understand why you would do that. As a public service, it makes it less valuable. And in the algorithmic feed, which is what people mostly find content through, even though they are still using Twitter, what you would see over time is, again, a stark downward trend where they are encountering, and this, I was only able to start noticing this a couple of years ago because he made the view count public. So I could then see oh, even though I'm, a stark raving liberal here complaining about people like Brett Stevens, I could see that my content was encountering fewer and fewer eyeballs, regardless of my Twitter following. So the number of people that you follow, the way that I would say you're deluding yourself is you're looking at number of followers as opposed to what the algorithm prefers.
Well, no. Well, I'm only asking. May I rephrase it? I'm only asking. Are you saying that if I,
Mhm.
as I will tell you, proactively
Mhm.
seek out and am aware of all of these people, I will tell you, I see their tweets and their links every day that I look at Twitter.
Mhm.
I'm exposed to what they're doing. So, are you saying that if you make the proactive choice that I have made, I can get a fair sample of what Bernie Sanders thinks, or Elizabeth Warren, or Robert Reich, or Ben Burgess, or Joe Brown and Joy Gray, all of those people that are out there, I can follow them so long as I proactively put them on my list.
If you proactively put them on your list and use the who I follow feed instead of the algorithmic feed, they will still show up for you. So
Okay.
if you take enough steps, then you can still encounter them. Like you
All
did
right,
on-
not much of an effort.
on-
It's just one click. I follow them and I see them every day. But okay.
Right, but you also need to make sure that that you're on the non-algorithmic feed. Basically, in the same way that
Okay.
any social media company is constantly creating more friction for some types of content and less friction for other types. If you compare your experience on Twitter 4 years ago to now, what you'll find is that you have to work harder and harder in order to keep on seeing the content of that particular audience.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Which again is the reason I think it has been net negative for society compared to the platform as it used to exist.
And then to follow up, what you would say to anyone that they should follow your example, abandon Twitter. There are only so many hours in the day.
Mhm.
Abandon Twitter and go to what is the site you mentioned?
Blue Sky.
Repeat.
Blue Sky.
New Sky.
It was a project of Twitter
Blue Sky.
that was spun off during the Jack Dorsey era.
Blue Sky. So you say Blue Sky is a preferable alternative for almost any political viewpoint.
I wouldn't say any. No, it is true that the people who have moved over to Blue Sky are the people who are unhappy with Twitter. Now, again, Blue Sky was set up during Jack Dorsey's era as a version of Twitter that would run as a protocol as opposed to a for-profit company. It is it's a B Corp, but also since the Blue Sky protocol, I think it's the AT protocol, can be run by other companies, that's a different approach that makes it more censorship resistant. Because if you don't like its content moderation choices, somebody else can engage that protocol and give you a different content moderation choice. That's also Mastodon has taken another protocol-based answer to the content moderation problem that is pro-free speech while letting people make their own reach decisions and not leaving it all up just to a company that has bills to pay and needs to reward its shareholders.
Okay, for the final Professor Turley, Blue Sky or Twitter, are you a follower of Blue Sky as well as Twitter? What would be your recommendation to those who are listening?
I'm not. I've been exclusively on Twitter. This may be because I'm a bit of a dinosaur and I just am not very sophisticated, but in terms of social media, but I'm happy with Twitter. I don't have a particularly large following. It's less than 1 million, but I don't think it's particularly large, but
it's pretty big.
It doesn't really matter to me. What I do like about X now, I should say, is that I think there is a greater diversity, but I was there under Twitter as well. I was critical of what Twitter was doing. But at the end of the day, what I tell my friends who are going to Blue Sky is that I think it is a mistake. It's particularly a mistake for my friends who are on the other side of the of this political divide in terms of the election results. I mean, I think that the reason the election results were surprising is that people were too insulated. They were too deeply entrenched in an echo chamber. As someone who works for the media as a columnist and an analyst on television, I've written about this a lot. I worked for CBS twice, NBC twice, BBC, and I've seen a lot of this sort of echo chamber development in the media that's probably not going to be It's probably not going to change. But I think that one of the results of this election should not be to further submerge yourself into these types of safe spaces. I do agree with the professor that that X is supposed to be the public square. I think it is. It has all of the positive and negative aspects of the public square. I often don't read my comments on my blog or on Twitter because there's a lot there that I don't particularly want to engage in. I think that they have every right to express their views of me. Many of them are, maybe not favorable, but that's fine. But the question for this discussion is it a net positive to have X in this array of different sites the way that it is today? I think it is, because it adds to the diversity that wasn't there before the Musk takeover. And there was a time when my friends on the left really felt comfortable in every social media company, every platform. And yes, certain views were amplified over others. I would note one more thing, by the way, where I disagree. I don't believe that the primary reason you go to social media is content moderation. I think that social media for many people is this powerful communication system where they can reach out. The internet itself is the most important invention since the printing press. And as I mentioned in the book, when the printing press came out, the first reaction of governments was to limit the printing press. The internet scared the daylights out of governments. But also now with social media, those are very powerful sites for communication. I believe the primary thing that people look to for these sites is not content moderation. It is because of the size of the audience that you've taken a public square that used to be a small area in the middle of London, and you've made it global. And that's why it's such a huge advantage to free speech. And that's why I'm happy that Twitter is now X, and X is still there.
I think you're segueing into
one point.
Yep,
Let's make one point.
Okay.
Which is, it strikes me that we have moved from a version of Twitter that Professor Turley found very offensive, where employees from Twitter were interacting with some government agencies to figure out which types of content should be more promoted and which should be shut down. We are now at a version of Twitter where Elon Musk is spending basically every day with President-to-be Donald Trump, helping to dictate what government policy should be and which agencies should effectively go away. He's calling for people who work for the government to be fired. That it seems like a much closer relationship between Elon's Twitter and the government than the version of Twitter that we had 2 and 4 years ago and the government. And yet it occurs to me that you now find this to be just fantastic, and you're telling us it's better now. That at least seems to me like a contradiction, or one where now it's the party that you like, so you find it to be more amenable engagement.
No, once again, I have to object. It's not because it's a party that I like. It's not because it's a party that I like. I like free speech, and I think I have a record to show that. Once again, you're trying to make it sound like I like X because I'm on the winning side. That's just not true. But I don't know why you want to go there. But the most
X is a lot closer with the government now than it was 4 years ago, right?
But when you say, what I remember of Twitter is things like suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story. Many of us were writing as columnists at that time, saying that this seems self-authenticating, that we know the other people on the other side of this email. Twitter itself came out and apologized, of course, for suppressing that. But that was a very direct, in my view, biased decision. But more importantly, it's not all white nationalists. We went through all these scientists that were censored, that were removed from the site, many of whom have views that are now being vindicated. We didn't have that debate on Twitter because of all of the censorship. That's the cost of censorship.
But it's also a lot of white nationalists, right?
Okay. You got a lot of white nationalists. All right. Well, I tell you what, we've got other arguments. I think you guys are beginning to segue into your summaries, and therefore we want to call a halt. It was very lively. It's always a pleasure when you have to tell both guys, please restrain yourselves, because Clearly, you've been actively and very engagingly exchanging your views. We now have to take another pause for our sponsor before we get to the summaries.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion.
All right. Yes. Okay. We now go to the summary portion of this debate. Each side gets 5 minutes to summarize according to the rules. The affirmative goes first on the summary. Take it away, Professor Turley.
Well, once again, I appreciate being made part of this. I think that we had some interesting discussions, even with our points of disagreement. There is a different view here in terms of what's the primary purpose or draw of social media, but also how we measure the positive effect of a company like X. It's not, in my view, that it's profitable. It's not in the same way that you can't measure the impact of censorship and what makes it wrong by whether people survived or didn't survive or ended up being able to prevail after being canceled. What we really have to look at is what free speech is and why we value it and how these social media companies are different, because they are communications companies. They play a critical role, not just in our political, but social discourse. I think it's a good thing that we have X. And it's not because I happen to agree with Elon Musk. There are things we disagree with, and I've certainly criticized him in the past. What I like about X is that it has brought voices back in. And that does not mean that I like all of those voices. That's the test of free speech. That's the test of principle. That is, if you really want to see a robust and free public square, you have to accept there will be voices in there that you find grotesque, that you don't agree with. But we're all better off in the fact that we can have these common spaces. You don't have to listen to them. You don't have to follow them. But it's good to have a site that engages in less rather than more censorship. And that's what I think makes X unique. But when it comes to Elon Musk, in my view, he's a complex individual and people either love him or hate him. But I don't think you'll find a more consequential figure in this generation in terms of advancing the interest of free speech. I'll tell you, as someone on the free speech community, we were on the ropes before he bought Twitter. And then he released the Twitter files. And we were able to put the lie to many of the apologists who were saying that there's no evidence of widespread coordination. It's not a nothing burger, Professor. It is detailing agencies, offices, dozens of government employees who worked at Target and censor American citizens. I don't consider that a nothing burger. I consider that something that is so distasteful that we should be able to come together and say it's a good thing that he revealed that and that we're having this debate.
Professor Karpf, 5 minutes of summary. Take it away.
So, Professor Turley mentioned earlier that he's a free speech dinosaur. I would say I agree that you sound like a classic free speech guy from the 1990s. You mentioned earlier in the debate that social media platforms today are like the telephone network. And the difference between telephone networks and social media platforms, again, is amplification. I've heard a lot tonight from Professor Turley about the suppression of views. The reason why these platforms are able to suppress views is that they are actively engaged in deciding what to amplify and what to suppress. That is part of what they provide as companies, is they decide what types of speech are we going to show people more of, and what types of speech are we going to tamp down on. Elon Musk, during his time running Twitter, has often suppressed types of speech that he does not like. He's kicked journalists off of Twitter. Barry Weiss, who produced some of the Twitter files, criticized him for kicking journalists off of Twitter for reporting on a controversy, just for reporting that a controversy existed. And he then got mad at Barry Weiss about it. People constantly, when they get on Elon Musk's bad side, find that their audience has gone away over the past few years. Because again, I did not believe that I was coming here tonight to debate ideals of 1990s free speech. I have notes on that as well. Particularly, I've got notes on the problems of disinformation in a time period where there's so much money behind spreading lies online. But I was asked to come here tonight to debate whether or not Twitter under Elon Musk has been net positive or negative for society. I would again suggest to our audience that if we are thinking about the trend lines, if we assume that there was a value of Twitter to society prior to the takeover, and we ask ourselves honestly, is it doing better now or worse? Not just financially, but as a platform that society relies on. The fact that people like me are all leave a bus debate that you're talking about is really just veiled threats and attacks. Like there's no actual rational critical debate going on there, because what people want is to spur views because that's where the money is, because of the system that he has set up. Twitter is worse now than it was prior to him taking it over. His grand goals of building a better platform, the X, the Everything app, or some grand public square where all views would be heard, has worked out poorly for him and for us. It's an embarrassment what he's done to that platform. And the only good news is that people have been finding other better platforms elsewhere. If you think the diversity that we're now seeing on Twitter today is greater or better than the diversity of speech that we had prior to that, I don't want to end with an insult, but I'd say that that's a very strange version of diversity, because the voices that are now more prominent on Twitter are voices that certainly don't represent the depth and breadth of views in society, and it's nothing like the idealized public square that we're supposed to have here. The company's gone poorly. We all know it. It's not going to get better. If you like Twitter, sure, stay there. But if you like Twitter as it was circa 2014, 2017, it's not going to get better. You should go find a different platform, because the way things are now, even though it's worse than it was 2 years ago, it's still better than the way it will be a few years from now. And my last note is, again, if we think that the relationship between Twitter and the government circa 2020 or 2022 was problematic, I would suggest to you that any principled individual over the next few years is going to be astonished and appalled at the relationship between Elon Musk's Twitter as a propaganda platform and the Donald Trump administration. I'll end there.
Thank you, Professor Turley, Professor Karpf. I will say on my own behalf, as the director of the Soul Forum, that my only regret is that I was unable to have you both on my Soul Forum stage in front of a live audience of 200 people who laugh, cheer, and boo occasionally, which adds a kind of electricity to the evening. And then we have a reception afterwards in which both debaters are invited and usually attend to further interact with the audience. So that's our twofold mission. And both of you, the highest compliment I can pay to both of you is that you are both definitely candidates to go the whole 9 yards at thesoulforum.org. Look it up, thesoulforum.org. You'll see our debate scheduled for early 2025. You did a terrific job, and you'd do even better if you were on the Soul Forum stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd tell more jokes if there was an audience.
Yes, that would be great. That other one was a great one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.